The French government is trying to impose its own version of class warfare on French workers, and the response has been rather dramatic. There have been wide-scale demonstrations effectively shutting down the country. What do you think of that?
Well, it's really not anything particularly special that the French government is doing. It's applying a version of neoliberal structural adjustment, which is rammed down the throats of the third world. They have no choice, and is increasingly being applied in the industrial societies as well. The United States and Britain considerably in the lead, but in a globalized economy, others are being dragged along in one way or another. The difference in France was primarily the response, not the programs. There remains a tradition of working class solidarity and activism that surprised a lot of people, in fact. And that's what happened. It will basically have no effect, I don't think. But the manifestation of it was interesting and important and could be one of the many strands in leading to initiating other comparable reactions, which could have a mutually reinforcing character sooner or later.
Yeah. Were you surprised?
Yeah, I was surprised.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened in other places where people have been hit much harder.
It strikingly didn't happen in Decatur, Illinois, where just about at the same time this thing was going on in France, the 18-month UAW strike at Caterpillar just collapsed.
Well, it did collapse, you're right, but it was interesting to see how about 80% of the workforce voted against the capitulation. The contract was a complete capitulation to Caterpillar. That's recognized on all sides. It was a rout, as the business press called it. The workers at the plant voted 80% against it. The union leadership decided to accept it, and may have been right. The point is that the forces were so unequal that the chances of their holding out were very slim. In the United States, but it's not comparable to France. The United States is unusual in that in France it was a matter of working class solidarity, but working class solidarity is actually illegal in the United States. We don't have things like general strikes or even secondary boycotts. They're excluded by law. The laws are designed to undermine the possibility of acting on general class interests or other general interests, which is quite unusual among industrial societies, maybe unique, at least among the more democratic ones. In France, this was a national issue. In Decatur, Illinois, no one knew about it. There was barely any coverage of anything that had been happening, except in the business press now and then, or in the Chicago Tribune and that kind of papers that are business-oriented and nearby. But very few people knew anything about it. As you recall, when Decatur workers came to the Boston area to try to raise some support, they could barely get any people out to a meeting. Which is very unusual. Almost anything gets a big crowd if under comparable circumstances. So they were left alone, hanging on a limb. And Caterpillar was in an extremely strong position. It had, like corporate America generally, it has made huge profits in recent years. I think about 40-50% profit growth in the last year, if I recall. And they've used their profits for a very sensible business strategy. These are people who are fighting a bitter class war. They used it to create excess capacity overseas, so that, as they explained to the business press, they could undermine any workers' action by simply using their other facilities, many overseas, to produce to ensure that they maintained their market. And also in the United States, again, unusual, maybe unique among industrial societies,
Yeah.
It's permitted to employ permanent replacement workers, which is worse than scabs, to destroy strikes. The U.S. has been cited for that by the International Labor Organization, but it continues, and a huge number of part-time workers and so on. So Caterpillar was in a very strong position to carry out a very efficient class war in an successful effort to undermine some of the last remnants of American unionism, and there was very little general solidarity, in part because there was simply no awareness. The thing was kept under wraps, and also because the options for common action have been very much undercut, in part simply by legal measures, and in part by a huge onslaught of propaganda to make that appear to just simply drive such ideas out of people's minds and leave them alone, facing awesome power by themselves.
One other thing about the Caterpillar strike in Decatur, there's almost been Stalinist-like restrictions on the returning workers. Could you talk about that?
Almost. I mean, the Wall Street Journal had an article, which was headlined by saying that workers have gag rules imposed. They are not. The company will allow some workers to return, which is already pretty outlandish, but they are under a gag rule which requires that they say nothing about the strike. They say nothing critical of management. They don't wear T-shirts that have something that the company considers harmful to their reputation or something like that. It's straight Stalinist. It's not Stalinist-like.
Yeah. Well, let's actually move on that note of Stalin to Russia. Recent elections there have seen a revival of support for the Communist Party. Is that entirely unexpected?
Well, I don't quite interpret it that way. I think that the way it's interpreted is, it's not just in Russia, it's all over Eastern Europe. There's the standard version, which actually was given in a New York Times report that I'm almost quoting, is that that nostalgia for the past is increasing as it recedes further into the distance. Well, I don't think there's any indication of nostalgia for the Stalinist dungeon. What there is, it's not that the past is receding, it's that the present is approaching. And the present happens to be Brazil and Mexico. Whatever one thinks of, however horrifying the Soviet socioeconomic system may have been, the way people live in the conditions in the countries that we run, the comparable countries that we run, are for the most part much worse. So for a large part of the large majority of the population of places like, say, Brazil or Guatemala or Mexico and so on, the conditions of Eastern Europe would have seemed very impressive indeed. And now what the people of East Europe are seeing is that they are being returned back to third world conditions, the conditions of the countries that we've been running for a long, long time. And that, as that approaches, they don't like it. Just as if the population in our own domains had a choice, they wouldn't like it either. And that's I think what one is seeing, not a kind of revival of love for the dungeon that has disappeared.
Moving on to Haiti, there were elections there also very recently, and generally U.S. commentary has been very critical of Jean-Bertrand, Aristide, and the Lavalas movement. Can you talk about that?
Well, it's critical because it's actually mixed. I mean, the U.S. First of all, the commentary is based on. It's important to recognize that certain crucial facts are still kept very, very quiet. In fact, one is that there was no embargo to speak of.
Right. We've discussed that. Right.
Yeah. Did we talk about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, and the second is that Aristide was allowed to return under a very strict condition. Did we talk about this?
Yeah, that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Under very strict conditions, and he hasn't entirely been living up to them. Haiti is, in a way, like France. There has been. It's one of the few countries where there has been popular resistance to the imposition of these neoliberal programs, structural adjustment programs. And Aristide has roots in among the people, and he has to some extent reflected that, and has not gone along as willingly as the usual third world elites with the orders from Washington and the World Bank and the IMF and so on. And Haiti's been punished for that. The very limited funds that had been offered have indeed been withheld because of a refusal to undergo a program which would essentially dismantle the entire governmental system and turn it over to private power to an unprecedented extent. They've been dragging their feet on that. There's been a lot of popular resistance, and as a result, Aristide is criticized. But the democratic structures which swept him into power, the grassroots movements, have not been demolished despite years of terror. And although he has, lacking any alternative, in my opinion, gone along pretty much with the external power that allowed him to return, he hasn't done it with the proper willingness and enthusiasm and devotion to the masters, which does arouse criticism.
Yeah. Do you know anything about the new president, René Préval?
Well, he's been close to Aristide and does reflect pretty much the same, I think, as essentially the same base of support.
Now, Haiti was an example of what is called humanitarian intervention. Somalia is another. Bosnia is also cited. Are there instances where you would support such actions?
Well, the category, first of all, I suppose just about every military action in history has been described as humanitarian intervention. They may not have used that term, but some similar ones, always with very noble purposes. And if you try to find genuine examples in history of authentic humanitarian intervention, you're going to find pretty slim pickings. On the other hand, I don't think you can give a general principle about when the use of military force is legitimate. It depends on what the alternatives are. So there are circumstances in which maybe that's the least bad of the available alternatives. You just have to look at things on a case-by-case basis. There's some general principles that one can adhere to, but they don't lead to specific conclusions for every conceivable case.
Now, I know in the question of Bosnia that you were bombarded with requests and in some cases demands for support of intervention to what people called genocide. Number one, was it genocide?
Well, genocide is a term that I myself don't use, even in cases where it will be appropriate.
Why not?
Well, I just think the term is way overused. I mean, Hitler carried out genocide. That's true. It was a determined, and in the case of the Nazis, it was a determined and explicit effort to essentially wipe out populations that they wanted to disappear from the face of the earth. That's genocide. The Jews and the Gypsies were the primary victims. There are other cases where there has been mass killing. The closest, for example, the highest per capita death rate in the world since the 1970s has been East Timor. In the late 1970s, it was by far in the lead. Nevertheless, I wouldn't call it genocide. I don't think it was a planned effort to wipe out the entire population, though it may well have killed off a quarter or so of the population. In the case of Bosnia, I don't think, I personally would, where the proportions killed are far less. I mean, it was horrifying. It was horrifying, but it was certainly far less than that, whatever judgment one makes, even the more extreme judgments. But I just am reluctant to use the term. I don't think it's an appropriate one. So I don't use it myself. But if people want to use it, fine. I mean, it's like most of the other terms of political discourse has whatever meaning you decide to give it. So the question is basically unanswerable. This depends what your criteria are for calling something genocide. On the calls for military intervention, they were of an interesting character. They were very vague. I've never seen during all these years in which there's been a lot of laments about the collapse of Western civilization and so on and so forth, I just didn't see any substantive proposals as to what could be done. Do something was what people said. Send troops, but what are they going to do? You know? The substantive proposals were extremely slim. What has been done, I think, is quite ugly. What has been done is, and I think this has been sort of in the works for a long time, is essentially leading to an effective partition of the region, the former Yugoslavia, except for Slovenia is out of it, but except for that, the rest of it into Greater Serbia and Greater Croatia, with Bosnia pretty much partitioned. They may call it a state, but it's just going to be part of it will be part of Croatia and part of it will be part of Serbia. Greater Croatia is already pretty much a U.S. client. The U.S. has been helping it arm, has been supporting it, and so on. And I think the U.S. anticipates that the same will be true of Greater Serbia, so that'll place if it works out that way, it'll place the U.S. in effective control of the former Yugoslavia, which is pretty much a return to the previous status quo. And that region has considerable significance from the U.S. perspective. It's always been regarded as part of the periphery of the Middle East, the whole system of protection and control over energy resources. And it's also a kind of a base for entry into the restored third world of Eastern Europe, where there are common interests among the major industrial powers, but there are also conflicts. So the United States has somewhat different ideas about how to exploit Eastern Europe from those of, say, France and Germany. And the base of the Balkans places the United States in a position to implement its own power interests and economic interests and so on. So a U.S. takeover of that region, or more accurately, a retakeover of that region, is not an unexpected goal of foreign policy. What the U.S. has done is sort of stood on the sidelines as long as it was tough going there, and when it looked as if a military balance had been established primarily by U.S. aid to Croatia and indirect aid to the Bosnian Muslims, in which in fact the U.S. actually let Iran do a lot of it. Now that balance was more or less set, and it looked as though it would be possible simply to insert U.S. forces to separate warring armies without too much threat or danger, and of course commitment to use massive force if anything goes wrong. Then the U.S. sent in troops. Now, if you ask, suppose I'd been in Congress, let's say, and had been asked to choose between exactly two alternatives. One, let them keep massacring one another. Two, put in U.S. troops to separate warring armies, to partition the country into two U.S. dependencies, with a possibility that that something may go badly wrong, as in Somalia, and there might be a huge slaughter. If those are the two choices, I probably would have voted for sending the troops.
What about Germany's interest in and links to Croatia? Do you think that's significant?
Yeah, it was very significant. Germany took the initiative in the early stages in a very premature recognition of Slovenia and Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, Slovenia, it was sort of reasonable, I suppose. But in the case of Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, the recognition was done initially at German initiative, and the European Union went along very quickly. It was done without any concern for a rather serious question, namely the rights of substantial Serbian minorities. That's not to justify the way they reacted, but they did. There were legitimate concerns, and they were not taken into account, and that was just a prescription for disaster.
Yeah, Michigleni and others have cited the German recognition as igniting Serb fears of a resurgence of German power in the Balkans. I mean, they have memories there.
Yeah, they have plenty of memories. Everybody has memories. And again, none of this is justification for what happened, but the recognition of the independence of Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina without any concern for this obviously quite serious problem was throwing a match into a can of gasoline.
Now, it seems to me, and I'd like you to critique what I'm saying, that Clinton was very anxious to supplant UN forces with NATO. Do you agree?
Only at the right moment. As long as it was difficult, they wanted UN forces in there. As long as there was fighting and danger and difficulties in getting humanitarian supplies and so on, the U.S. wanted to be out of it. NATO means the United States. It's a cover for the U.S. The U.S. only wants to move in when the game is over, and it can sort of pick up the pieces. So the hard work was done by the Europeans. You can ask how well they did it, pretty badly, I think. But nevertheless, it was their task. The U.S. was on the sidelines. It was willing to bomb, but nothing else. By the time it seemed as if it was the conflict had a possible resolution by insertion of force, massive force that would not be under any threat. By the time that looked possible, the Clinton administration wanted NATO out and wanted to take over. And it's not very different from Somalia. In the case of Somalia, as long as the conflict was raging and there was a terrible famine and people were dying and there was a lot of murders and so on, the U.S. just simply stayed out. It wouldn't have anything to do with it. When the fighting was declining and it looked like there was going to be a good harvest and there was a fair chance that the famine was, the Red Cross and other efficient agencies were getting food through and so on. At that point, the United States moved in with a massive show of force and a huge PR operation, expecting to, get a lot of at least favorable publicity out of it. And indeed, that would have happened if it hadn't been for U.S. military doctrine, which is unusual. It requires that the U.S. forces never be put under any threat at all. If someone looks at them the wrong way, we use, call out the helicopter gunships. That's why the U.S. is pretty much disqualified from peacekeeping operations that involve civilians. And they've made it very clear, incidentally, in Bosnia that they're going to do the same thing. Massive force if anybody gets in our way, unlike these wishy-washy Europeans who, don't just kill anybody in sight. In Somalia, it led to a disaster. According to U.S. sources, about somewhere between 7,500 and 10,000 Somali civilians were killed before the U.S. forces were withdrawn. And that was not a very conflictive situation.
And you're saying that the U.S. was responsible directly for those deaths?
Good bit of it. Just violent overreaction to minor provocations. They're the kind of things that other countries don't respond to. So, for example, look, at the same time that U.S. forces went into Bosnia with huge coverage and front-page stories and so on, if you really looked into the back pages and the small items, you might discover that at that very same time, Norwegian peacekeeping forces in southern Lebanon were attacked by Israeli tanks, and several were severely wounded and hospitalized. We don't know the rest of the story because it wasn't reported. Well, if anything like that happened to U.S. forces, even anything far less than that, there would have been a massive military response.
Well, can't also the U.S. Point to these kinds of interventions as a justification for continued massive military spending?
Sure, that's used for that, in fact. The Somali intervention was pretty openly described that way. Howell and others put it in pretty much those terms, pointing out that the Pentagon budget was in trouble and they needed some good public relations.
Let's turn now to focus on the Middle East. It is received wisdom that the September 95 Oslo Accords has pretty much settled the Israeli-Palestinian question. The typical headlines were, Israel agrees to quit West Bank. It was a day of awe at the White House. The undeniable reality, the Palestinians are on their way to an independent state. The Jews are bidding farewell to portions of the Holy Land to which they have historically felt most linked, and on and on. You take exception to those views.
Well, not entirely. I think some of it is correct. It is a day of awe. It was a tremendous victory for the rule of force in international affairs, a very impressive one, and an extraordinary doctrinal victory as well, and maybe that should inspire awe. And it's possible that it may resolve the conflict pretty much the way that what the great powers have been doing in Bosnia may resolve that conflict by partitioning it. There are ways to resolve it. The way in which, say, the problem of the Native Americans was resolved. It was resolved. They're not around anymore, so the problem was resolved. The Israel-Palestine problem may be resolved in the same fashion. Certainly, the Oslo agreements were a long step towards it. On the other hand, the factual descriptions are just farcical. Israel didn't quit the West Bank. It indicated no intention of quitting the West Bank. In fact, it made very clear its intention, and its intention means Washington's intention, because otherwise it doesn't happen. So Washington made clear with its Israeli client, that is, that it would not quit the West Bank. Simply look at the bare fact. In fact, on and on, the rest of the story is just the most outlandish fabrication. Just simply look at the bare fact. This agreement didn't deal with the Gaza Strip, where Israel retains the roughly 30% that it wanted, and in fact, in its recent budget, has just assigned that part of the Gaza Strip to Israel itself. It's the budget places it under the budget for the negative, and that cuts off the areas assigned the Palestinian administration from any access to the Arab world. In the West Bank, which was covered by the Oslo Agreement, September 28th, they divided it into 4 areas. One area is total Israeli control. That's 70%. Another area is given to Palestinian administration, the municipal areas of half a dozen cities. That's 2%. The remainder, roughly 28%, consists of about 100 isolated sectors within the Israeli 70%, which are given local autonomy under overall Israeli control. There's a 4th region, that's Jerusalem, which Israel has already annexed, and Jerusalem means Greater Jerusalem, a big expanding area, a substantial part of the West Bank. And it's kind of intriguing that if you look at the maps, not only in Israel, but also in the New York Times, they simply assign that area to Israel. So the New York Times map colors it the same color as Israel, just talks of the West Bank as everything but that. So that region, though theoretically up for negotiations, has already been assigned to Israel by itself and the U.S. government and the New York Times and so on. So those are the 4 areas. To talk about Israel withdrawing from the West Bank under those conditions is ridiculous, and it becomes even more absurd when you look at the further conditions. In return for Israel retains veto power over any legislation conducted by Palestinians anywhere in any of the areas where they have a degree of autonomy and local autonomy. The Palestinian authorities are required and agree to accept the legality of Israeli rights in the West Bank. and Israeli sovereignty over what Israel will determine to be state lands or absentee lands. Those are pretty loose categories, but they will amount to essentially what Israel feels like keeping. So in effect, that incidentally totally undermines UN 242, completely dismantles it, the basic diplomatic framework, which called for withdrawal from the territories, and of course, and it completely rescinds the decisions of the Security Council and of just about every government in the world that the settlements are illegal and that Israel has no sovereign rights in the territories. That's all rescinded. Palestinian Authority agrees to accept that Israel does have sovereign rights there and that what it does is legal and legitimate. You look at the proportions that Israel essentially, actually, if you compare it with what there was great talk about the amazing transformation in Yitzhak Rabin. He was willing to concede. Israel was willing to make a historic compromise and so on. Simply compare what they took in Oslo II with what they had been calling for at the peak period of refusal to have any dealings whatsoever with the Palestinians or to recognize any of their rights. So in 1988, for example, when the U.S. and Israel were refusing any dealings with the Palestinians, any recognition of Palestinian rights, extreme point of rejectionism. At that point, Yitzhak Rabin was defense minister, and he called for keeping 40% of the West Bank in Gaza. They didn't want the rest. And that's the traditional position. Okay, now they've got between 70 and 98%, depending how you estimate it. About twice as much as what they had asked for at their most extreme position. I don't think they're going to keep that much. It would be crazy. In subsequent imposed agreements, I presume that they'll reduce their own integration of the territories to what they've always wanted. Meanwhile, it's not just words, it's also actions on the ground. So the new budget, which was just passed by the Knesset, the parliament, in late November, after Oslo II and after the Rabin assassination, calls for tens of millions of dollars for new settlements in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights, funded, as usual, by the American taxpayer in one or another fashion, and offers even inducements for new settlers, including, just to show how extreme it is, there are new settlers who go to the Gaza Strip, which is a very arid area where people don't have drinking water. New settlers who go there and will be given special subsidies for fish ponds in the new budget. Well, that's typical. Meanwhile, the military budget, Israel's military budget is going up, but mostly for the construction of what they call bypass roads, a big network of infrastructure, roads that'll enable Jewish settlers in the West Bank to travel freely without even seeing, scattered Arab villages, which are kind of isolated from one another and will disappear somehow. And it also cantonizes the region, breaks it into separate areas. So whatever local autonomy is granted won't have any larger significance.
In a Z Magazine article, you make an analogy with the Oslo Accords and New York State ceding authority over certain parts of New York State. What was that? Can you describe that?
Well, it's kind of as if the New York state and city authorities decided to cede control of, say, the South Bronx and the slums of Buffalo to local authorities. Meanwhile, taking the wealthy urban areas, the usable land, the resources, the commercial and financial centers, in fact, anything they wanted. They'd be delighted to do that if they could.
How do the Oslo Accords treat the question of Palestinian refugees, right of return and or compensation?
Yeah. Well, that's simply gone. There's nothing there for the refugees. And Yitzhak Rabin and his colleagues have made it very clear and explicit that they are not going to get anything. They're out of the game. that the U.S. backs that. Remember, everything that happens there happens because the U.S. backs it, otherwise not. So this is U.S. policy, more extreme, much more extreme under Clinton than his predecessors, incidentally. And the idea is to somehow just scatter them like human waste somewhere. That is in direct violation of long-standing international agreements, going right back to the UN Declaration of Human Rights in December 1948, one provision of which called for the right of return of people to territories from which they had been expelled, and the explicit intention was the Palestinians, as was made clear and explicit the next day when the UN unanimously, including the U.S., endorsed the right of return or compensation under this provision, Article 13 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. That's all gone, totally. I mean, it's never been more than rhetoric, but now even the rhetoric's gone.
But are you saying that Washington runs everything and there's no such thing as Israeli sovereignty?
Oh, no, it's not that there's no such thing as Israeli sovereignty. I mean, look, the state of Nevada has some sovereignty, too, but Washington's influence is overwhelming. Remember, Israel gets a degree of foreign support that is just off the scale. There's no country that even comes close. You can't call it the 51st State of the Union because no state gets anywhere near that amount of per capita aid from the federal government. And there's no country in the world that, I mean, it's just not on the spectrum. And U.S. influence in the region is overwhelming. The U.S. controls the major oil producers. Egypt's a client. Turkey's pretty much a client. Pakistan often has been up until the Iranian. As long as the Shah was in power, Iran was another client. And the U.S. influence, of course, it's not total. It's not even total in Central America, but it's very extensive. And in the case of Israel, the dependency is extremely high.
In that same Z Magazine article, you say that the U.S. gives $3 billion annually to Israel, perhaps twice that if we add other devices. So I have two questions. What are those devices, and how does Israel command that level of U.S. aid?
Well, there's a whole range of devices which have been looked into in some detail by people like Donald Neff and others who have arrived at the $6 billion figure. They include loans that are turned into grants, delaying payment, all sorts of financial trickery, handover of technology. There's a whole mass of devices. I think Neff's rough estimate of about $6 billion probably isn't too far from the mark. The $3 billion alone is unprecedented. How does Israel get that degree of aid? Well, there's debate over that. I mean, there basically have been two positions. This is independent of whether you support it or you oppose it. People, whatever position they take on that, they've divided over two factors. One factor is the domestic lobby. The second factor is the strategic role that Israel plays in U.S. general global policy. My own view is that it's the second factor that's largely responsible for this.
The one you've called the local cop on the beat while police headquarters...
Actually, it's not I who called it. I'm borrowing the term from
Melvin Laird.
Richard Nixon's Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, while police headquarters remain in Washington.
Well, that's my term.
Yeah.
So his word was, we need local cops on the beat, and I just added a little gloss, and police headquarters remains in Washington.
Well, whether it's the $3 billion official figure or the $6 billion figure, that's an awfully high salary to pay for a cop.
Well, the U.S. gets a lot out of it. For one thing, a lot of that, remember, a lot of the so-called aid, take that $3 billion, a lot of it is military aid. Well, what's military aid? Military aid is payment by the U.S. taxpayer to U.S. corporations. That's money that doesn't move out of U.S. banks. Incidentally, that's true of a lot of foreign aid. So you want to pay off you want to maintain the high-tech sector of the U.S. economy. Well, the way we do that is through under a military cover, and one way of doing it is producing and exporting high technology waste. That's the majority of the $3 billion, and then there's plenty more that's involved. So there are mutual operations in technology development. There's intelligence sharing. Israel has been a mercenary state. If the U.S. So, for example, when Congress imposed human rights constraints on the Carter administration and wouldn't let them, and the Reagan administration wouldn't let them participate directly in the ongoing slaughters in Guatemala, they could turn to Israel for help. Not just Israel, Taiwan, Britain helped out, the Argentine neo-Nazis. The U.S. is a big boy on the block. It uses, it has big terror networks, but Israel's been a big part of this in Africa and in Latin America and Asia and elsewhere. But its primary role is is a crucial part of the system of support of the family dictatorships that the British used to call the Arab Facade, that manages the energy resources and ensures that the profits flow to the West. There's always been a kind of tacit alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and now, in fact, it's likely to come more to the surface. That's an important role. In fact, if you take a look at U.S. aid, it shot up in 1967 after Israel smashed the forces of the Egyptian forces, the Nasser, which was the leading force for independence in the Arab world and considered a great danger. So Israel smashed that, and aid to Israel shot up. It went up again, in fact, more than quadrupled in 1970 when Jordan was carrying out a massacre of Palestinians. And it looked for a moment as though Syria might intervene to support the Palestinians, at which point the U.S. asked Israel to just mobilize to bar that, and it did. And the Black September, as it was called, could continue. That was considered very important. Henry Kissinger himself described it as one of the most important contributions that Israel made, and military aid shot up, and so it continues. These are some of the reasons why I'm skeptical about the domestic lobby interpretation. In my view, domestic lobbies work insofar as they line up with major power interests. Then they may have an effect, even a swing effect, but not an independent effect.
Is there a figure on how much money the U.S. has given to Israel since 1948? Does anybody know?
Yeah, sure, you can find it out. It wasn't enormous. It was high until 1967. So virtually all Israeli capital formation up till 1967 was from external sources, either from the U.S. or German reparations. Remember that the U.S. gives aid in another way too. Israel's the only country to which it's possible to make tax-free donations. If you want to make tax-free donations for the purchase of land from which Arab citizens are excluded, you can do that tax-free in the United States, and that amounts to a lot of money. So if you add up all the money, even up to 67, it was pretty substantial. But after that, it just goes off the, it goes off the chart. In 1978, Israel was receiving more than half of official U.S. aid worldwide. It's usually run about a third, and that's just the official aid. It doesn't count the other stuff. You could look up the total number. I don't recall offhand.
Yeah. It's been suggested already that if there is a Syria-Israel deal on the Golan Heights, that the U.S. will essentially pay the bill.
Well, pay is in a sense it'll pay the bill, but the U.S. pays the bill for maintaining the state altogether to a large extent. Similar to Egypt. Egypt is the next, if you take a look at U.S. foreign aid, the biggest component of it is Israel, Egypt, and Turkey. and it has been Pakistan. It varies a little bit over the years, so there have been years when El Salvador was up there, but over a long period, it's basically those states. And per capita, of course, that means overwhelmingly Israel. And that's all part of the system of what the Nixon administration called the local cops on the beat. The Arab facade that ensures that the flow of profits from oil go to the West, mainly to the U.S. and Britain, and not to the people of the region. That Arab facade needs protection from its own population. And there has always been a ring of gendarmes that provides that protection. And they get supported.
However, the New York Times is writing articles about Tel Aviv is awash with luxury cars, that Israel's a rich country, its standard of living is higher than a couple of European states, in fact.
Yeah, it's a rich country, thanks largely to outside aid. On the other hand, it's also, remember, it's a U.S. client, which means it's becoming to resemble the United States. So it has a very high level of proportion of the population living in poverty. And it has extremely high inequality. I think it's second only to the United States among the rich countries.
But the question arises in this time of so much obsession with fiscal austerity and budget cuts, why is this money not being a topic of debate?
Well, how about the subsidies to the wealthy in the United States? Is that a topic of debate? The Pentagon budget just went up. The fiscal austerity means fiscal austerity for the poor, not for the rich. Here's some figures from Israel, if you're interested, in the Jerusalem Post a couple of weeks ago. Record headline: record 670,000 lived under poverty line in 1994, an increase of about 24,000 over 1993, going up very fast as the wealth is going up. In this respect, it's quite similar to the United States. But the fiscal austerity is a term that's not intended seriously. There's no fiscal austerity for the Fortune 500, who've just celebrated their fourth straight year of double-digit profit growth. There's no fiscal, and part of the reason for that profit growth is precisely federal subsidy. The Wall Street Journal, for example, by now these guys have forgotten what capitalism is even supposed to be. There was a front-page article in the Wall Street Journal the other day about two states, Maryland and Virginia, which were competing with different strategies to see which could, for economic development. And it said, well, for a while, Maryland looked at it was going ahead, and then Virginia did, and all full of talk about their entrepreneurial values and the business-friendly climate and so on and so forth, and what great success stories they are. Virginia's now in the lead. Well, take a look closely, and you notice that it's not Virginia and Maryland. It's the parts of Virginia and Maryland that border on Washington. And the difference of strategy that's being followed is that Maryland has been banking on biotechnology, expecting to rip off the National Institute of Health and so on. And Virginia has been banking on electronics and high tech, counting on ripping off the Pentagon budget. That's their business strategy. Which part of the federal government can we use to subsidize us? And the reason why Virginia is doing better is because they picked the winner at the moment, namely the Pentagon system, which is the traditional technique for maintaining high technology. That's called entrepreneurial capitalism.
Right. That creates the opportunity society that the
But there's no fiscal austerity there. There's fiscal austerity for children whose mothers don't live the way Newt Gingrich says they should.
Let's get back to the Middle East, if we can just wrap this up. When writing and speaking on the topic, you sometimes cite Israel Shahak as a source. Who is Shahak?
Israel Shahak has been for many years Israel's leading civil libertarian, a militant civil libertarian who has been defending Palestinian rights and the rights of other oppressed people, no matter who's oppressing them, whether it's the Palestinian authorities and the PLO or Israel, since for some years, since shortly after the '67 war. He also writes quite a lot about religious coercion and its effects, which are quite extreme in Israel, and many other topics. He also is an invaluable source of information. He circulates, to people who can read Hebrew. We've been personal friends for years. He sends tons of stuff from the Hebrew press, and then he does a lot of translations, which have been very useful. Because the Israeli press covers things very, for example, the occupied territories with considerable accuracy, way beyond anything that one finds here. So that's been a very valuable source. He himself is a Holocaust survivor from the child in the Warsaw Ghetto, and ended up after the ghetto uprising in Bergen-Belsen for a couple of years, and then went to Israel.
You've always been critical of Yasser Arafat and his leadership of the PLO. Have you seen anything in the last few months that's perhaps caused you to reassess your view?
Yeah, it's getting worse.
Oh, in what way?
Yeah, I mean, I've always, as you say, always been critical back to the time when he emerged in the late '60s, and pretty harshly critical all through. But now it's getting much worse. The repression in the West Bank is quite serious. It's reaching as far as even, not just the usual targets, but even very visible figures, leading human rights activists, editors, and so on. The control of the electoral process reached such a level of absurdity that it was condemned by European Union observers. Israel had made it very clear what the kind of arrangement they were making with Arafat was made extremely clear. Right after the first Oslo agreement, Yitzhak Rabin, who was prime minister, this is now September 1993, the great breakthrough. Rabin was explaining it to his party, Israeli Labor Party, and he pointed out that, or maybe it was to the parliament, I forget which, he said that it would be a good idea to have Arafat's forces carry out local administration, that is, run the local populations instead of the Israeli military, because then there won't be any complaints to the High Court or protests from the human rights organizations or from mothers and fathers and bleeding hearts and so on. In other words, they can do a good job. Israel, in fact, is shifting to the traditional form of colonial control at last, instead of when the British ran India, or white South Africans and Rhodesians ran their countries. They tried not to use their own troops. They used local mercenaries overwhelmingly. The U.S. does the same in Central America. We try to use the security forces. If it's necessary, U.S. troops go in, but local mercenaries called state security forces or paramilitary forces are much more efficient for exactly the reasons that Rabin said. And that's the role that the Palestinian Authority is supposed to play. And if Arafat doesn't play it, he's not going to last long. That's the deal they made with Israel. In return, they will be treated very well, like third world elites generally.
It's interesting to contrast. We talked about U.S. aid to Israel and U.S. generosity to the Palestinians, for example. The U.S. is committed to providing $500 million over 5 years. It's, you don't have to be a math student to figure that out. That's $100 million a year. It's not much money.
It's virtually nothing. Just the other day, a couple days ago, I got a letter from an Israeli friend, a professor in Israel, Ben Gurion University, who's runs the group, the one Israeli human rights group for Gaza. He goes up and back to Gaza, and he told me there's terrible poverty and this and that, but there's some construction and development going on, and no sign, he said, of any U.S. money. What money there is from the European Union or some other source.
Right. Just earlier, before coming here, I was looking at your 1974 book, Peace in the Middle East, and it had a question mark. at the end. And you were part of a group that had a vision of a binational state in Palestine, and it seems that events have gone in a diametrically opposite direction. Is there any chance to revive that dream?
Yeah, in fact, I think that that's the only plausible outcome at this point. I was always pretty skeptical, as you recall, both in that book and later about the two-state settlement ideas that were being proposed, and that were in fact the international consensus for quite a few years. That never seemed to me very reasonable. Maybe some kind of federal arrangement or something, but at this point, when the issue of two states is dead, there is not going to be any meaningful Palestinian state. It's over. In fact, there will be no Israeli withdrawal. That's pretty clear. The only reasonable outcome, what is being instituted is a kind of an apartheid system, as has been pointed out by Israeli commentators, meaning something like the system that South Africa imposed in the 1950s, even with Bantustans, which they'll call maybe a Palestinian state. And the right end result of that is to overcome apartheid, as in South Africa, and move to some sort of either a cantonal arrangement or a federal arrangement or some other form of arrangement that will recognize ultimately, I hope not too far in the future, the equal rights of all people there, which is going to mean their communal rights as well.
Yeah. There never was much sympathy as you look over this whole question over the last 40, 50 years for the Palestinian side in the U.S. And the little that was is virtually disappearing. For example, there was the Middle East Justice Network and its newsletter, Breaking the Siege. They're no longer in existence.
Well, you have to be a little cautious about that. The American population, the general population, has been in favor of a Palestinian state by about 2 to 1 for most of the time that polls were asked, and that's without any hearing it anywhere. So, as usual, there's a big difference between elite opinion and general opinion. But among elite circles, you're absolutely right. So in the press and in elite discussion and journals of opinion and so on, the Palestinians don't exist. They're just a bunch of terrorists. So for just to give one trivial example, when the New York Times assigned Greater Jerusalem to Israel, did you hear a peep of protest?
No, there was nothing. Yeah, and also the figure that is given for the settlers on the West Bank and Gaza always excludes Greater Jerusalem. So, for example, this figure in circulation is 130,000, but
which is under half of the settlers. In fact, Teddy Kollek, who was the mayor of Jerusalem, was considered a great hero here, a great humanitarian, and a marvelous person who was bringing about Arab-Israeli harmony in Jerusalem. What he was doing, in fact, was setting up highly discriminatory regulations and procedures to try to force a Jewish majority in East Jerusalem, where the population was being crammed into narrower and narrower quarters, not permitted to build, while land was being confiscated. He was very clear about it. He said, look, I'm not going to do anything to help the Arabs unless it's needed for the benefit of Jews. So he said, yeah, we'll improve their health standards because we don't want them to get cholera, because maybe it'll spread to the Jewish population. But beyond that, nothing, except occasionally for some, picture window effect, as he called it. That's what the U.S. is funding, and not only that, but what American intellectuals are calling, as Irving Howe once put it, strides towards social democracy that are an inspiration to all of us.
I know you're always kind of reluctant to suggest things for people to do. Might there be some, avenues that people can pursue in this particular issue to render justice?
Sure. I mean, this is one of the easiest ones there is.
Why do you say that?
Look, there's a very well-established international consensus, which the U.S. itself helped frame. In fact, was instrumental in framing, which calls for total Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, period. That was official U.S. position. In fact, the U.S. framed it. That could be reconstituted. with the reason it collapsed. I mean, it happened to it collapsed in the government under Kissinger's influence in 1971, but it's not an option because people aren't aware of it. Nor does there have to be any support whatsoever for aid policies that go to carrying out what I just described in Jerusalem, or take what's called aid to Israel is a funny kind of aid. It's the kind of aid that is driving more and more people under the poverty line. I mean, it's aid in the usual sense. It's aid to some sectors, harming other sectors. That doesn't have to happen. Countries should receive aid. I don't think rich countries should have the priority for aid. But if they do, it doesn't have to be the kind that leads to a record number of people under the poverty line, going up higher than any rich country outside the United States. It doesn't have to be that sort of aid any more than we have to have that kind of social policy here. There's plenty that Americans can do, especially in this area where U.S. influence and power is so decisive. But of course, as usual, it requires first escaping from the tentacles of a propaganda system, which in this particular case is really awesome in its power.
What's ahead for you, Noam? I know you have a trip. What's ahead for you? I know you have a trip coming up to India.
Yeah, a couple days.
And what's that about? What are you going to be doing there?
Usual thing, mixture of. It's initially political talks organized by an Institute of Economics in Delhi, and then extending around from New Delhi to Calcutta to Hyderabad, Trivandrum, and Kerala, and it's mostly political talks, a mixture of linguistics talks and talks on other topics.
Yeah. Now, you were last in India, what, 20 years ago?
More than that, 1972. I was there to give Nehru Memorial lectures.
It'll be interesting to talk to you about your impressions of India when you come back.
I'm afraid when I look at my schedule, my impressions are mostly going to be airports and the insides of lecture halls.
What about, we started this series of interviews with your sort of contemplating maybe winding down things at MIT and your teaching career there. Any further thoughts on that?
No, not really. I have no definite plans. I mean, there are lots. I forget what we talked about. That was a long time ago, but it's very uncertain.
But you want to keep the sort of your rigorous schedule of talks and incessant requests for interviews like this one at the current level?
Well, want is a funny word for it. I mean,
do you have a choice?
I expect that I will. Yeah.
Is there much choice with the level of demand?
Not only that, but just feeling of, sort of that I'm not doing what I should. So.
Well, if you had your druthers, what should you be? What would you rather be doing?
No, I mean, what I should be doing is way more of this kind of thing. It gets pretty wearing. But...
Well, thanks a lot, Noam. And
okay.
yeah, we'll see. Yeah, we really appreciate it. And I'll see you in early February. We'll follow up, on your India trip, and I'll be there for that. The trade union program with Elaine and all that.
Yeah.
So we can hang out then.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Bon voyage, huh?
Yep.
Okay. Bye-bye.